If any building should have the effort and labour expended on it, so that it is laid out with beautiful dimensions, proportions, then doubtless this should be done for the temples, in which God, Master of the universe, must be adored and praised by us to the utmost of our abilities, and thanked for the innumerable benefits continually bestowed upon us. And it goes on very much in that vein. And in summary, he says that the most important, if you glorify a house, you must glorify a church more. Because a house is for yourself and the church is for God.
Yeah, well,
and God is more important. And also, if you are going to bestow beauty on a city, the best way to do it is through its temples.
That was a little reading from Palladio's 4 books, book 4.
The very beginning of book 4.
On temples and, by implication, churches, which are obviously the 16th century version.
I think for Palladio, they are the same building type.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about how his theology made that work, but for him, he conceives...
Which is a little... It's one of the things which seems a little bit paradoxical about the culture of the period, isn't it? That is that everyone is kind of obsessed with Rome and with Roman... the buildings, like the buildings that the Romans built for their religion. But... obviously you can't go there in terms of it actually being true.
Yeah, and a lot of people, I get the feeling that because they like ancient Greece and Rome so much, they kind of don't mind that a church is a bit of an excuse to do a temple.
Yeah.
But with Palladio, and for him, I think he's really thinking, no, like temples are... They always were in some way echoing some glory of God.
Well, you're joining us on About Buildings and Cities. We are entering the final part of Andrea Palladio's life in this episode. That one of the kind of last big chapters centred on Venice is his forays into sacred architecture, into the design of churches. And there's a series of different church projects in Venice. And then there's one little... kind of very small church, which was built at Macer on the Barbaro estate, and they form, well, and obviously they're a very different thing from a house. They've got very different requirements, and they form, like a different sort of chapter of his whole life and career.
House for God is a different sort of house. All of these projects are undertaken in the last 20 years of his life.
Yeah.
And most... later than that.
Yeah.
Also, bear in mind that being in your late 50s was older then than it is now.
Yeah, a little bit.
I don't know what the life expectancy was then, but it probably wasn't your late 50s.
No. He's still got quite a lot left in the tank, actually, at that point, but we'll...
Young architect.
Yeah, young architect. So I guess we should get into talking about some of them. I don't know if it's interesting to talk at all about the context of building a church in the 1560s and or kind of more broadly in the Renaissance. It is something which we've talked about a little bit before. Like, it's sort of formed as a building type and a model and a sort of model of plan long before the turn back to classicism as a style. One of the big things which is sort of in question in the Renaissance and afterwards is, like, to what extent are we going to throw out everything versus trying to make the new style work with the old forms and the old types of buildings. And kind of at this point, it's more or less decided in the latter.
Although I would say this is something that had happened in his earlier life, but Palladio's not building churches in his early career, and which is, I guess, the end of this period of formal experimentation, when you're going from, at the beginning of the Renaissance, a lot of the famous church buildings are people putting Renaissance fronts on, like, basilicas.
Yeah.
Or building centrally planned chapels or churches.
Yeah.
By this point, they're sort of settling in on something that's neither a basilica nor a centrally planned church, but is a basilica with a dome at the end.
Yes.
So where a basilica classically is a big hall with 2 rows of columns.
Yeah.
And at the end there would be an arch.
Yeah.
Uh,
Like kind of apse or
like
like
an apse.
alcove. Yeah.
the apse is being replaced with a little sort of centrally planned church.
Yeah.
And in a way, if you think of, I suppose if you've had a similar upbringing to us, if you think of what a classic church is
Yeah.
to us, it is something which has got a high tower at the end. But that's not at all true in Italy before this point.
No. The thing of having like a crossing with a tower on top is a bit of an English peculiarity, isn't it? In the Middle Ages,
they have them in France as well, but they don't have church spires. The bell tower in earlier Italian churches is a freestanding.
somewhere else. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but that's kind of where we're coming down on. And there'd been a lot of to and fro. Should we do centrally planned? Should we do basilica? And people trying and experimenting with different shapes and thinking about how you can, put a dome on a square or put a dome with chapels. And we seem to be coming down on that. And sometimes also there are chapels coming off either the dome or the main body.
Yeah.
In the initial design, which was also not universally true earlier on. And that's kind of the ground condition, I think, of where we are. I can't think of, in the immediate period before this, any really famous facades put on the front of long churches that are classical. So we've had them earlier. You've got Alberti's,
Yeah.
or various other ones. But in the period immediately before this, in the first half of the 16th century, this may be a limit of my knowledge, I can't think of any really famous facades. So, like Michelangelo's centrally planned St. Peter's doesn't really have a end facade because it's centrally planned.
Yeah.
One of the things we're going to talk about is his front facades of churches. I struggle to know what was the really cool thing before people were doing this. Whatever it was, I think it's been erased.
Yeah, so we could talk about this first project. Just to say something about, I think, essentially the story of kind of getting access to all of these projects, which are for a different class of client and have, I think, quite a lot more budget, is I think they come through the Barbaro family, who were very well connected and who were able to provide a useful introduction. And so there's something which I think we've discussed also in our Alberti episodes. There's a sort of problem if you're trying to put a classical facade on the front of a traditional basilica, which is it's got this rather awkward shape. It's a kind of tall hall in the middle with a pitched roof, and then it has aisles on either side, which are sort of lower. But it means that you've got this sort of funny profile on the front with like two lower bits of roof and then a higher bit of roof in the middle. The way in which you make that into something which looks like a Roman temple is not at all clear.
Because basilicas in pre-Christian antiquity are not temples.
No.
They're civic buildings.
Yeah.
And as the empire becomes Christian, they make the intentional step to get away from pagan architecture towards civic.
Yeah.
And then when people kind of get more back into the idea of these temples being nice buildings, you've got a problem because you want to kind of combine two things that are disparate.
I mean, one thing that you can do is that you can build a portico on the front, so that you kind of build columns which are detached from the front of the church, and then you can like roof over that, and you sort of lose the
narthex.
That's not really viable in the context San Francesco della Vigna in Venice, and in the case of a lot of churches, because actually you can't just like build out from the front because it's already hard up against the street.
Yeah. I think actually, though, I'm not sure he would have built a portico out on this one, even if he could.
Yeah.
I think this is a solution which is as good and doesn't require you to do that.
Yeah.
So, what's this church? It's San Francesco
della Vigna.
Which is
of the vines.
It's actually on one of the main islands of Venice. Barbaro manages to get them to chuck out the facade design that was initially proposed and get Palladio in. And he does something for the first time, at least to my knowledge, which is earlier on we were talking about in the villas episode, we were talking about this kind of compounding of forms.
Malcontenta. Yeah, sort of layering.
A layering.
It was almost like a collage of kind of classical sort of motifs and forms on top of each other.
Yeah, and a trope, I would say, in general of Mannerist architecture is taking classical forms and in some way manipulating them in a kind of non-classical way, using this language to write new works. And his approach is the superimposition of two temples.
Yeah.
A wide,
with little
short
columns.
temple with little columns.
Yeah.
And a more conventionally proportioned temple. And they are superimposed almost in like bas relief.
Yeah.
Which was a radical step. And they also have this thermal window and openings. To make the proportions work, because Palladio is always keen that his classical orders are in proportion, he has to do some manipulations. One is, the main bit of the church is too tall to be a temple.
Yeah.
I actually think the Romans would totally have just
gone bigger.
But but the solution to that is to raise the whole thing up on a plinth.
Yeah.
And
except for the door, except the actual door in cuts through the plinth.
Yeah,
so
which obviously you've got to because because on the other side of the door, the floor is that level.
Yeah.
I mean, you could have some stairs, I suppose, going up to a door and then coming down on the inside of the church.
That'd be big, big move. But so the plinth is part of the collage, isn't it? It's yeah.
You've got a band with a door cut through it. The plinth is quite high.
Yeah.
Like the height of a person.
Yeah.
2 meters or something. And that's like a flat thing that the back temple, the wide temple, is sitting on.
Yeah.
And then the columns as they come down of the central temple kind of get their own little feet plinth which come out. Graphically, there's a lot of manoeuvres, I think, done to make the taller temple, that's the full height of the church, appear to pop forward.
Yeah.
So it's because its columns are bigger, they stand out more. They've got little plinths which stand out a little bit.
Yeah. The
pediment, the sort of detailing of it, the cornice is a bit thicker.
Yeah.
But in fact, actually, it's all projecting about the same amount.
Yeah.
You know, the cornice of the wings projects, and it's like the whole thing has been collapsed down like a drawing.
Yes.
It's a kind of orthographic, or like
it's
a bas relief sculpture of the front of a temple.
Yeah, it's like one of those sort of traditional elevations where you've coloured in all the shadows on the drawing or something, where it's technically flat but sort of popping out of the page. It benefits enormously, as all these buildings do, from this sort of strong, high directional sunlight that you get, which makes all of the shadows frequently very crisp.
And the material, which is this lovely stone. I don't know which one it is in this particular case. That gives everything a like delicate weathering, which you don't necessarily get.
Traditionally, the stone of Venice is from Istria, so round the Adriatic. I don't know if that's the case in this one, but I would assume it would be.
It doesn't feel at all weird until you start looking at it and you think, this is too...
Yeah.
A bit that does seem...
Well, fundamentally, the whole project of classicism is very perverse. But once you've committed to it, this is a very coherent way of doing it.
Yeah, especially in that kind of Mannerist incarnation where it's about transgressing within the rules.
Yeah.
Or like breaking some rules and keeping others.
Yeah.
Going back again... One thing that feels quite transgressive is you sort of do and sort of don't have. This is something that goes through the back temple, kind of cutting through the front temple.
Yeah, so the lower, if you imagine the back temple has a triangular pediment, and the kind of lower, the bottom part of that, the kind of hypotenuse of that running across, it's suggested by the porch above the main door. But it's also actually not quite expressed like that. And it's also suggested by some of the much flatter detail in the two bays in between the door and the kind of side wings, which is, it's quite cleverly done, isn't it? Because if you were to express that too much, I think it would feel too transgressive. So...
But that was, just a facade.
Yeah, from a church which is just a facade to a project which is actually all interior, at least in terms of his authorship. So I think around the same time he was appointed to work for the monastery of San Giorgio, which is on the Isola San Giorgio. It's like is one of the most like spectacularly located sites in the whole of Venice. It's basically kind of opposite you as you look out from across the basin of St Mark, right at the bottom of the Grand Canal on this little island. And it's the facade in this case, although it looks very Palladian, is apparently by Scamozzi and not really in keeping with his design.
Who inherited, we've probably said this before, a lot of the projects.
Yeah.
And had a slightly confrontational attitude, would you say, to Palladio's designs? Often felt he wanted to change them because he was better, resulting in worse designs.
So I think that he started off with various smaller things in this project, like he did a refectory for them. Yeah.
It's on the edge of an island that you can see from St Mark's Square.
Yes.
And that means that you not only have this orthographic collapse of the facade, but in a way, because you're looking at it from so far away, you're kind of seeing the whole building perspectively.
Yeah.
And so you have a kind of collapse of more elements, including the dome of the back of the church. And it appears to me that there is some sort of awareness of, or I think it might just be in this church, that because he's using a proportional scheme, the various elements work together all like orthographically.
Yeah.
But we will see him take what he's seen from that.
Yeah.
By the time this isn't finished in his lifetime, but by the time I'm sure he's working on the next famous project, he will have seen it, and we'll see what he does with that kind of later.
So the plan of this one, you can see, as we were talking about, there's a crossing, a kind of like crossing going across the nave, and it's got a big dome on top. This one is quite wide, and it has a sort of proper aisle as well as a big kind of central nave. And then being like a monastic church, it's very two-sided. So there is a big, I don't even know what you call this. Is this like a choir, or there's a sort of detached bit for the monks, which is right at the back? The way these monastic churches work is that there's a big sort of quarantine zone for the monks to do their holy bit, and then there's a bit which normal people are sometimes allowed to come into, which is sort of on the front side.
The kind of brief is, you should be able to like go to the church and absorb some of the holiness of the monks.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't be able to see the monks.
Yes.
And you shouldn't be able to interfere with them. You need some method of kind of screening the two bodies from each other. And also a sense that they're in a very holy bit.
Yes. Yes.
Which leads to this plan that is a bit of a journey, a continuing of the journey from St Mark's Square, where you can see the monastic church.
Yeah.
They're doing good things over there. You arrive by boat onto the little square in front. You see this facade that is somewhat Palladio.
Yeah. You've
got the first space of the church, the crossing, the holy space beyond the crossing.
Yeah.
A slightly more brightly lit choir, but you can't see into the lower levels of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which kind of exists as a kind of a bright but unobtainable.
Yeah.
And quite a long way off. There's quite a lot of like perspective.
Yeah, you're seeing all the way down. Yeah. So in between you and it is would be kind of like a sort of screening element. It's I mean that sort of presentation of the monks is part of this kind of counter-Reformation agenda for church design, isn't it? There is a sort of series. Obviously, the Catholic Church isn't entirely lying down the fracturing of the church and the formation of all these alternative brands of Christianity, and like they're definitely coalescing away around a series of principles for how to do strong, powerful, resurgent Catholicism with a new set of principles and a kind of
It's interesting because Venice is Catholic, but it never has a good relationship with the Pope, and I think I think they're kind of going in tandem intellectually.
Yeah.
But I feel that in terms of literal sponsorship and in terms of who's paying for the jobs, and they maintain a slight independence.
Yes.
I don't think any of Palladio's churches are paid for by the church.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Well, so this one would have been paid for by the foundation. I guess they had their own wealth.
That's it. The Redentore is paid for
by the city.
By the city.
Yeah.
Masser is paid for by the Barbaro family.
Yeah.
The previous one is paid for by that commune of that part of the city.
Nevertheless, there are some pretty influential ideas going around about how a modern church should be designed, and I do think that his design has taken a lot of those on board.
100%. I think.
So there are sort of ideas. I mean, to kind of summarize, maybe like I feel like we should summarize sort of the broad strokes of it. There's a big work on it from the 1560s by a cardinal called Carlo Borromeo. And which is sort of generally taken to kind of crystallize what the principles are. It's not kind of coincidental that these churches are like big, white, that ornament, religious imagery are confined to particular places, like chapels, altars, and otherwise not evident, more medieval ways in which the God and the principles of Christianity were meant to be evoked have been stripped away, and they've been replaced in this design with like much deeper, more symbolic, more kind of sublimated, more like, I don't know, more kind of abstract, I would say, kind of ideas like the fact that the church is a cross is important. The fact, as you were saying, that the monks are kind of separated in a very, very clear way from the laity is important and kind of symbolises a proper understanding of the distance between the kind of sacred life and the mundane. All the same, like I feel like there's a kind of a bit of a problem of what to make the inside of it like. Like it shouldn't just be neutral or kind of pragmatic. It's still got to be grand. It's still got to glorify, but it has to do it in a way which embodies a certain kind of restraint, I guess.
And looking at we're looking at a view from roughly the way in to the church down the centre, and we can see Palladio's masterful treatment and take on several previous generations of Renaissance architecture. So the core sort of material treatment, which is in grey stone and white plaster, so the details of the arches and, columns are dressed in grey and everything else is white, kind of dates back, to Brunelleschi, like the old sacristy or the Pazzi Chapel. This is, in terms of the plan of the church, it's that kind of synthesis of a bit earlier. It's the basilica with more stuff added on to the end.
Yeah.
And there's another take, which I think had already been established, which is that the light is best when it's kind of high and indirect.
Yeah.
So the light comes in from things like the dome, but also from high up thermal windows, which are these arched windows with columns in them, at the tops of the aisles.
Yeah.
So when you're in the centre, you can't really, unless you look sideways, you don't see out of the window. You just have the light filling the space.
Yeah.
And animating these cut surfaces.
Yeah, we're not doing stained glass anymore, are we? And I mean,
we haven't been for quite some time.
But it's important that you can't see out, and it's all like super important that you can't see in.
All of that stuff, in a way, isn't Palladio.
Yeah,
he's just doing that successfully. Then what is he doing? Well, I mean, firstly, he's handling, I think, the light very artfully, and you have points that are lighter and darker as you go through. I think originally, by the way, in that first photograph for people who are looking, that organ wasn't there.
Yeah, no,
which is massively mucking things up, because it's meant to be that you look through this screen that you can't see through into something.
But you can see a kind
of bit lighter beyond.
Yeah, a light-filled.
A light-filled choir at the back. And then there's this kind of amazing detailing.
Yes.
So we've had all these different takes of what you do with the columns and cornices and capitals, the arches, which are dressed in stone,
Yeah, yeah,
and grey, and his in. Whereas when we go all the way back to Brunelleschi, it's very simple.
yeah,
It is one thing. There's a single attached pilaster or a
Yeah.
little bit of a cornice or something. Here we have a real multiplicity of shapes.
Well, it's kind of all variations on the column, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because
The column, the column and its bits.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what makes up the order. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not for nothing that, sure, there are more things to the order than a column and the thing on top of it.
yeah,
But that's what you think of when you think of the classical orders.
that's what it's all about. Yeah.
And this is Corinthian.
You could say that when you look at the plan of the building, it has the potential to be quite complicated and quite confusing because it's got lots of different spaces. It's got this sort of separation between one part and the other. And definitely one of the things which he's striven for is to have a coherent sense of hierarchy between the central bits and the outer bits, but also to have a sort of overall unity of the space of a whole. And one of the big ways that he achieves that is with this internal kind of pediment line which runs all the way around the inside at like a consistent height, and then there's a second lower one which is in the arches which go through from the big space into the aisles.
Those are the heights of the two temples,
Yeah,
cornices on the outside, which are also the heights that the roof's arches spring from. So it's the central arch of the nave springs from that, and then the side things spring from the side ones.
yeah. And then he's doing something quite complicated, like in terms of flavors of columns. So you've got like a flat attached pilaster where the column is like a shallow rectangle in section, and then you've got a half round one where it's like half buried in the wall. And then do you also have one which is like a little bit more separated than that?
Well, you've got ones that go between the two. So you've got a giant order as well. So it like if I would just describe a kind of simple element of the building which has got most of the things, which is one of the piers.
Yeah.
So the building is built, the way it's actually held up is by a brick pier on both sides of the aisle, clad in this bundle of different columns, which are kind of a much more complicated version of something like what we saw on the corner of the Kirikati Palace,
Yeah.
the bottom where the loggia comes down. You've got a bundle of columns which are kind of made of a pier.
Yeah.
But here you've got a giant order on the inside, the tall bit of the church, which has got columns and pilasters, which sits on a plinth.
Yeah.
But on the other side, you've got some pilasters which go, instead of to the plinth, to the ground,
Yeah.
like we had on the front. They're kind of relatives of, on the front facade, the small temple goes down to the ground, and the big temple goes down to a plinth. But there are also things on the inside that go down to a plinth, and they both come in. So the giant order and the sub-order come in round, which is kind of half. This is like a semicircle coming out, and a little flat attached column, and they all exist in the same piers.
Yeah. It's pretty strange, isn't
And
it?
it's a real...
How did he decide which one to put where?
Well, I think there are rules.
Yeah.
And I think actually they
I
run
imagine
from
there
the
are, yeah.
outside of the building through the inside of the building. So
Right, okay.
these two temples are not just suggested on the outside, they're kind of suggested running through.
Yeah.
He's got two kind of complete orders. So I think he's doing his like setting up an order thing and running with it.
Yeah.
And the fact is, though, you've got this bundling of little shapes next to each other is really visually exciting.
Yeah.
It's cool. You know, there are places that are even... There's a bit right at the back as it curves round.
Yeah.
Where it's just this stack of... I mean, I don't know how many. In a very free way. And it just means you just got so much visual excitement. So many things for the light to catch.
Yes.
And it's handled really nicely.
It does also mean, you've got these quite daring... There's like much more daring sort of overlaying in some of these moments than there is on the facade itself. You know, you've got like half round columns punching through pediment architrave things as well.
I'm not sure it's something we can tell a great deal of a story about, other than it's a, you know, you can have different takes on what to do with these moments, and his moment is he kind of completely subsumes what is massive brick architecture, with stacks and stacks of bundled columns, and makes it look cool.
It does look very cool. It is exciting.
It's very accomplished.
Yeah.
In what is just like white and grey.
And a couple of flavours of...
And white and grey Corinthian pilasters.
Big and small.
in 2 sizes.
Yeah.
Well done.
Very nice indeed.
Gets the About Building Cities seal of approval.
Yes.
For detailing.
5 out of 5.
Yeah. The plan isn't mega innovative in terms of, it's not a wild departure from what other people are doing. It works really well in the round as a sculptural form on the outside and on the inside, which is not true of lots of churches. You know, lots of like very exciting historical church interiors are kind of come at the sacrifice of the exterior, or vice versa.
Yeah.
It's not, I mean, helped a lot by a terrific site.
Yeah, one of the best you could possibly imagine, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he's used it properly.
Yeah. He's done good service.
They didn't get the wrong person in.
No, absolutely not. So that is San Giorgio. And there's another little church, but which I don't really have very much to say about, which is maybe we'll come to later. There's the Zitelle, which is another little monastic foundation, which he did a facade for, which maybe we'll look at in a second. The other really big famous church project is, as you said, this church paid for by the city. It's a church of a votive church, a church of kind of thanksgiving for relief from the plague, which had struck Venice in the mid 1570s and killed a lot of people, including Titian, I think, died in this one, didn't he?
Titian died around that time, so that sounds very plausible to me.
Yeah. So this is the church of
the Redentore.
The Redeemer, the Church of the Holy Redeemer, which is Jesus, by the way.
Yes.
And
for all you heathens out there.
And it's on the Giudecca. So the geography of Venice is that there's this sort of very long sausage-shaped island which kind of runs across the bottom, separated by a big channel. Yeah. So from the Zattere and from most bits of Venice, you're sort of looking across at it, and it means that this church, this is one which you really, really get to see in elevation, because you're separated from it by about 150 meters, and you can see it like dead on in that really flattened, perfect kind of view. Palladio died in around 1580, didn't he?
Yeah.
So, but it's kind of considered to have been built more or less exactly to his design, his sort of specification, and it's a very fascinating design, which also has a kind of interesting, like, they still celebrate. There's a special celebration called Redentore, which is at a kind of big gala day in Venice when they build what originally would have been a pontoon of boats across.
Is it not now?
No, now it's done, since the Second World War, it's been done by the army, and they have these rather pragmatic pontoons that they put across.
Okay, but they sort of still look like they're all boats.
They don't really.
They don't really. Okay.
Boats.
Well, I've never been there for it. I've never been there for it.
But everyone has a grand old time. Well, so it's got both a very famous interior and a very famous facade. This one, it's got both of them, and there's kind of lots to say about both things. You normally see it from very far away, and therefore it has that thing of being like an elevation, like that you see the dome, which is actually at the back of the church, and the two bell towers, which are these strange, slightly minaret-like little pointy steeples on either side. You see them in the view that you most often have. They really are kind of collapsed on top of the facade. And
this church, unlike any of the others, there is an elevation drawn by Palladio, which is like this one that we're seeing, where you see the whole, like, front to back of this long church flattened into an elevation. But
Yeah.
that is how you see it, and that feels like something that he's gained from the experience of the previous ones, because it's more than you've got the compounding of two temples on the front, but you've got so many more elements being compounded together to make what feels like a very accomplished, well synthesized. It's like a piece of, lots of ingredients in the stew,
Yeah.
but they are all balanced perfectly.
In terms of the main facade of the church, the one thing which has been done differently this time is that plinth, which we've talked about before as this sort of spacing element, actually in this one is actually the floor level of the church, and there are stairs which go up, so that you go up, and the columns which form the kind of main, like, centre temple bit of the design come right down to the floor on the front facade.
And the way that works is that this is a much less sort of sprawling church.
Yeah.
And the main body of the church is, what is that like?
It's quite narrow, yeah.
It's like 2/3 of the whole width is the body.
Yeah.
And then only, a sixth on either side are the two wings.
Yeah. And so this is it's like a church with just a nave and side chapels. It doesn't have aisles like the other ones have, which means they can be much shallower, and you can get like a much more square front profile.
You probably could have put just one temple on the front of this if you'd really wanted to.
Yeah, if you could have gone up a bit.
But it's much more exciting to have these things as flat drawings are more exciting than temples in a way, because they've got so much more going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's so many things to look at compared to a classical temple.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we're seeing with Palladio's approach. He's managing to kind of get his way, I feel.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel with some of the villas and palaces, we're getting sort of stucco decoration and things. Here, we're just getting a multiplicity of architectural details, which I think is where he was happiest and thought this was the most exciting sort of graphical format. And it feels like something that, like the back of Malcontenta, has got just loads of stuff going on. It's in stone on this facade, so it's grander.
Yeah. It's grander, and
it also doesn't have lots of windows.
No, doesn't have. Yeah,
Pictures. There's just a door.
Yes, and as before, we've got this overlaying of the different triangular pediment forms. We've got the big one, obviously, which is the crown of the main temple, and then there's a little one which is above the kind of main entrance going in, and then there's this back recessed one which we just have a little bit of sticking out over the sides. There's something slightly, the massing of the front of the church is a little bit peculiar, because the main roof of the nave is actually a bit higher than the facade, and it's dealt with by the roof is like hipped, so it slopes down. And that means that where it meets the top of the facade is actually flat. So it actually has a kind of flat top, which one of the things which the facade does successfully is to kind of contrive to lose that flat bit behind the point of the pediment, which is below it. And then at the sides, again, there's kind of yet another, in this case, really abstract sort of suggested pediment for these, again, to sort of cover this, what would otherwise be a sort of awkward bit for the top left and top right of the facade.
I think you can reasonably, if you're looking at this from a long way away, read 5 pediments on this facade, whereas the previous ones were basically 2.
Yeah.
You've got the main one of the temple, the one of the wide temple at the back,
Yeah.
a little one in exactly the same language over the door,
Yeah.
a kind of ghostly one picking up these buttresses,
Yeah.
and the hip roof.
Yeah.
All of which are at the same angle, the same pitch,
Yeah.
have kind of details, and are kind of becoming successively more abstract. And that's part of like what goes into making that such a, because they're all quite different. At no point does it feel like an element that's just been repeated.
Yeah.
Like each of those 5 things are recognizably their own.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. They're very kind of crisp and kind of cleanly expressed.
This is sort of an obvious thing, but when you're looking at it, the proportion and height and width of the dome at the back, as well as the hip roof, function with that front facade.
Yeah.
even though they're a long way back. So you've got the whole body of the church before the dome, but that's nothing compared to the distance across the water, which you see it at. So you can perceive these things, although I would say that the weight would be slightly less because they're that much further back than you see in an elevation. It feels like another element of the facade. That, I think, is part of what gives the long view to the Redentore, makes it so striking.
Yeah.
Well composed.
And then the interior, again, well, because you don't have aisles, everything is much more, like, it has a very, very strong sense of direction, kind of, leading you forward towards the space of the dome, which is brightly lit but kind of hidden. And then, unlike in San Giorgio, you can see this column screen which separates you from the space right at the back, which is a kind of sacred space which is meant to be hidden from you as a lay person. There's a much more of a sense, as in San Giorgio, you've got the like flat pediment thing running all the way around the inside, creating this big like horizontal datum line. It's also, I don't know, like it has a feeling of kind of screening you off a lot more, like they go up the sides and then they sort of like come around as if to suggest sort of partially closing off the space between you and the kind of sacred space on the other side.
It is also more closed off.
Yeah.
So the previous church is quite sprawling, and here it's much tighter.
Yeah.
A bit about the back. Obviously, there's the crossing with the dome, which is something you don't get in a basilica.
Yeah.
But it feels a bit like you've got the apse at the back of a basilica, but the back wall is just made of columns.
Yeah.
So that's sort of one manoeuvre. Ackerman suggests that he's thinking about the baths. In the big Roman bath complexes, you'll have a succession of tall, big spaces with screens of columns between them.
Yeah.
Which might be, a sort of circular drum space and then a box.
Yes.
And then another hall off that, each kind of leading one onto another. One might be the hot room of the bath and then, the kind of big hall. It's quite fun and fairly unusual to have a curved screen of columns on the inside of a building, and it feels quite exciting to me.
Yes.
It's a detail that feels very, powerful, and you don't see a lot of.
Mm. Yeah, that's at the back there. Or maybe we could talk a bit more about the nave. So it's got these side chapels, which are a bit like, they're sort of like arches which have been punched into the walls and which kind of have a little niche on either side. The columns, which are holding up the kind of big temple pediment, are paired. So you have this, what feels like very sort of satisfying arrangement where the big brick piers this time are treated as like a pair of columns with a little gap in between, which can have, something in between them, or it can have a little niche or something like that. And so you have this kind of paired rhythm going all the way down the nave.
It's a funny variation on, like, the Serliana in a way, where it feels like some sort of inversion of that, where you're kind of beginning and ending, instead of beginning and ending an arch with a column, you're beginning and ending a pier.
Yeah.
With a column with a niche in it.
Yeah.
The decoration here is a bit sparser, but no less interesting for it.
I think that there's a very careful control also of where the windows are and how light is used. I mean, as we talked about in the previous one, but perhaps to an even greater extent. He really tries to make it so that you're never really looking at a window. You would never naturally be looking at a window, that you would never naturally see the kind of source of illumination, but rather the light that you get inside is reflected and indirect. So that the windows in the drum of the dome are quite high up, and you probably wouldn't normally see them. You can only kind of see them by pushing quite far forward. And the ones in the nave are really high up and are sort of significantly blocked off by the depth of the cornice pediment thing.
And that has several useful effects. There's an obvious sort of metaphorical one, which is that it's nice that a place be filled with light that is seemingly of a divine origin.
Yeah.
At a more practical bent, if you can see a bright point of light, that will draw attention towards it.
Yeah.
But also it will create a glare that will reduce the contrast of the light being cast across a wall.
Yeah.
So if you can see, you know, if you're like walking into a big room and you can see the light bulb, you will be in the glare of the light bulb. That will draw your attention,
Yes.
but will also remove contrast. It will darken and remove contrast from the rest of the room visually.
Yeah.
So if you can block off the sources of light, but just have the light playing indirectly across walls,
Yeah.
you become much more aware. The contrast becomes much more enlivened because it's not blown out
Yeah.
by the direct influence of the light.
And I think that that's absolutely my impression of visiting it, is that you are very aware of the modelling and sculpting of the detail. It feels it's very like ambient occlusion, like lots and lots of sort of soft, crisp, well-defined kind of, sort of soft shadows. But everything is kind of very visible. You can see everything. And you do feel as if you are surrounded by this diffuse and slightly mysterious light.
I used to draw in Rhino when I was a student quite a bit, 3D things, to try and like light them, you know, when you're rendering it up. And I would always be like, oh, why can't I get the lighting
Yeah.
to look any good? And eventually I came to the realization that it would only look good lighting if you could make a design for the lighting that was good.
Yes. But that's actually very hard.
Yeah. You know, which is kind of like, well, how do you get the light in a way that makes it good? And then you can, oh, hang on a sec. Instead of dicking around with this stuff, I could just try and design it a bit better.
Yeah, that's always possible. Yeah, it doesn't always as easy as it sounds. But
I know, but that's sort of what he's done very well here. And in the photograph that those of you who are watching a video can see, they have unceremoniously, to a degree, craps on this by putting crappy like off brightness uplighters all around the place, which are not adding to the effect.
Yeah, they are a bit naff. There is a bit of a problem in the Catholic Church with kitsch. I mean, they're certainly not the only ones. Yeah, I mean, I was going to make an analogy, like when we talked about monasteries, we talked about this famous text about the role of light in the medieval church, which is that it's meant to come in through the window and kind of zap you with the kind of understanding of divinity. It's kind of directional thing. It's like the Holy Spirit comes in through the stained glass window and hits you in the forehead and kind of inspires
Ideally, in a sort of way that should be like St. Francis receiving the stigmata in the paintings, where it's like lasers going through a bit of...
Yes, or Philip K. Dick, you know, being hit by a like intergalactic pink laser, which happened to him late in life. He became psychotic, but anyway. But yeah, whereas this is... Yeah, it's kind of completely the opposite. It's directionless. It's something which is kind of feels totally evenly distributed and feels kind of all around you. I don't know exactly how one should read it symbolically, but the level of the kind of control of it as an effect, to me, means that it's definitely totally deliberate.
There are qualities that I think people at the time would regard as reasonable beyond just symbolism. Like a church should feel like it's full of peace and grace in a troubled world.
Yes.
And it should be beautiful.
Yes.
And clean and clear.
Yeah.
He's marshalling a lot of stuff to create that, quite apart from symbolism.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels extremely sacred. It's a very...
They shouldn't feel
place.
On the inside heavy and worked. Rustic. It should feel light.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a fun plan.
It's a very exciting plan. Yeah, these kind of complex like.
Also, if you look at the thickness of piers, there's like a real bundling of thickness at points.
Yeah,
and then where the weight is being taken by a dome, or where the building is lower, it becomes much more much less substantial when it's not taking on these huge. The body of the church, you've got those kind of like slice of toast buttresses,
Yeah.
which kind of come down to big, fat piers, which form the sculpted edges of these side chapels,
Yeah.
which have a little bit of light going into each other, but really are a bundle of columns making a sculpted mass in terms of the side chapels.
Yeah. The ones around the dome. Yeah. What is the rule here exactly? So the outermost one, I think there is some kind of rule that where you've got a column which is on a plane which is going to become an arch, then it's like a square pilaster.
Mm.
But then otherwise they generally seem to default to round.
The square pilaster is actually got like the actual wall behind it. That's an actual pier.
Yes.
That's been dressed.
So they're square where they are full of bricks.
As in, I think you don't want to take the edges away from that. You could put one out, but but then you'd lose your proportion on the arch. So
yeah, that's it. Yeah, because that's set out by the line of the arch.
Yeah.
So it's square. And then otherwise, where they're more about kind of introducing a sort of internal rhythm, they tend to be round
and thickening things as well. At this point, which is the springing point of the arch, the thickness of the single pilaster,
yes,
doesn't feel beefy enough to kind of be an element at the scale of the building. Whereas once you bundle a couple of columns on either side of it, everything's thickened up and starts to feel like a nice massive pier.
Yeah.
Although at no point does anything in any of these buildings, we say they're brick piers, but that's because we're thinking of construction. They don't feel like, so much is done to make them not feel like big brick piers.
Yeah. Yes.
And they don't feel like big brick piers.
No. You really, it looks like it's held up by columns.
Yeah, you don't look at it and think that is like a big kludgy mass of bricks.
It's all very believable. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something also about, maybe I could say something about the outsides of them and the way in which they behave in light. So this is, I'm just on screen showing a picture of the facade of the Zitello, which is this other one by him in between San Giorgio and the Redentore. Both the Zitello and especially the Redentore, they face basically due north, so you can see when people are trying to take photos of them that they have a real problem, because generally the sun doesn't shine on them, and if it does, it's only very, very obliquely at certain times of the year. They're almost always in shadow, but on a sunny day the shadows there are like this really rich, like cyan blue, because of the reflected water off the lagoon, which really is that colour. It means that you get this certain play of colours, which is obviously not in any of the drawings, but again feels far too controlled and far too kind of impactful to be like an accident. So you have like this blue, very softly shaded facade made of this white Istrian stone, and then you have the mass of the church, which is, as you were saying, is this like deep terracotta colour, and then you have, on the rest of the church, you don't have so much stone, but you still have dressings. You have these like white stone dressings, which in the sun are either like a bright white or like towards the end of day are kind of yellow. And you have this amazing play between this like rich like blue orange and this sort of slightly lemony yellow colour from all of the highlights. And it's an extraordinarily beautiful thing. When I was last there, I was taking these extremely crap like long range mobile phone pictures to try and understand the relationship of all these colours and the effect that it was having. It's part of what makes it really, really wonderful, is that whole kind of thing. That otherwise you would say, a bit of a missed opportunity to stick this facade in a direction where the sun almost never shines on it, but actually it's part of its
there's
part
a couple
of its
of
effect.
things. I think that's a wrong take, and I think the wrong take of like, it's got this really rich facade, so you're only really meant to look at it that way, and the rest of it's about the interior. I think it's a complete misapprehension of what's going on. I wanted to make an additional and kind of obvious point about these Venetian churches, which is that they're not just informed by the Renaissance and stuff. They obviously are also influenced by the history of Venetian churches. Yeah, and there are bits in them which are just the form of the dome, these funny pointy bell towers, kind of bits of the silhouette come straight out of, not the long classical revival tradition of Tuscany or Rome, but out of the Venetian Gothic. They would have known that.
Yeah.
And he knew that. But I think when you're not... when you're just thinking about this as a building as a slide in architecture history,
yes,
you might forget that
in the classical tradition,
these buildings actually exist in a place, and they take cues from that place. Rather like some, you get little bits of things that are kind of Venetian in other places, and that it's the place. He'd been to Rome a lot, but it's the like great city that he'd spent the most time in. And you can't help but have some things rub off on you.
Yeah.
It's easy when you're like trying to make a narrative about something like, the classical tradition, to forget everything else.
Yeah.
Because it is such an important step in that, he's able to go be a major step from the simple forms of classicism into the simple forms of classical architecture into the compound forms of classicism.
Yeah.
But you can do other stuff too. Lovely.
Really lovely, yeah.
I mean, these buildings and the basilica, I think, are the main qualitative things I think about with Palladio the most, probably. I mean, the feeling and the inside of the villas as well.
Yeah.
The feeling of these villas.
They're lovely. But
in terms of like having things with the most architectural meat, each of these churches and the basilica feel like there's a lot of he's pulling out a lot of ideas, and they're doing a lot of things because they're more architecty buildings, aren't they?
Yeah. They're very lovely. Yeah, so as you were saying.
Now for the canonical example of late style with Palladio.
So this
thing.
It is. So he built like a final little church commission for the Barbaro family on their estate in Macer, called the Tempietto Barbaro, as referred to. I'm not quite sure what its original name is. And this is a proper little Renaissance centrally planned church with a temple on the front.
But it's okay because it's kind of a memorial church to the Barbaros.
Right, yeah.
And so the site is, if you're standing in front of the gates of Villa Barbaro, and you look to your right, the road goes down and then it crooks.
Yeah. So
that you're axially viewed down the road, you see this.
Yeah.
And I don't know how far, like 200 meters away. So it's really in close proximity. At the beginning of this episode, I was saying how the era of formal experimentation in plan and general massing was over, but that's definitely not true in this case. This is a very formally adventurous play with classical, with a digestion of classical ideas.
And because it's a memorial church, practicality is less of an issue. You can go quite hard with the architectural exploration.
Yeah, it's a cross in a way between like a tomb and a church. I expect that when they were at their estate, they would go there as their church, but I don't think it was expected that that all the village would go there every day as their.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like a parish church at all.
No, not really.
So, shall we describe the architecture, which is quite different and exciting?
So, something about the massing. It reads as a sort of like a circular drum with a dome on the top, which is encased inside a slightly lower, like cubical block, like kind of cuboid block. So you read it, and then it has a temple on the front. But it's kind of quite a complex massing, and then the plan reads as a successful hybrid of a series of different like church archetypes, sort of more or less theoretical church archetypes. There is the theoretical circular church, which is an idea of a kind of perfect church, it's been around certainly in Alberti. There's also the Greek cross church, which is a church where it's a cross shape, but each wing of it is the same length, so that it's kind of perfectly symmetrical, which again it's a form of church which is thought to be geometrically more perfect and kind of like better, but for the practical demands of most churches actually doesn't work very well. I mean, it's also got other kind of elements in there as well, and it has to...
I mean, there's one extremely obvious one
Yeah.
you haven't mentioned, which is that it is really like the Parthenon. I mean,
Yeah.
the Pantheon.
The Pantheon,
sorry.
yes.
It's really like the Pantheon. It's a drum with a grey dome on top and
A little...
a pediment coming out the front in a very Pantheon-y way.
Yeah.
Now, there are some obvious differences, but it's
It's a kind of mini...
I can't think of a more Pantheon-y church.
Yeah.
So the things that the temple, which has 6 columns, is sort of tall. It's Corinthian. It's quite fine in its detail. There are a few steps going up to it, but it doesn't have any of this language of like plinths and things.
No.
It really is like it's a temple. It's even got plaster swags of,
Yes.
you know, in the Roman architecture you get these, which I think are taken from like wooden shrines in the countryside. When they were having a festival, they would have swags of flowers and the skulls of the previously sacrificed oxen and things between the columns.
Yeah.
And he's actually done these in stucco, these swags, and so it's kind of light and fine, and the colours are lighter, and the back it is I think originally that kind of terracotta bricky red.
Yeah.
Which again makes it feel more like the Pantheon as now. Originally it was covered in marble, but now it's a brick mass
Yeah.
with a stone temple on the front. But there are some differences. Instead of a hole in the top, there's a funny lantern, tall black lantern with a cross on top. And similar to that, there are 2 sort of pepper pot little bell towerlets very prominently on the front facade, coming up at the edge of the temple pediment. The temple pediment is most of the width of the front facade. There's not a lot of mass behind it.
Yeah.
Less than you feel even when you're seeing the Pantheon. Although with the Pantheon, when you're looking at it dead on from the square, it actually feels much less because it's kind of curving away from you. So in perspective, it feels less. And this one you see from a lot further away than you would see the Pantheon.
Yeah.
So it's kind of correct grammar that it would be less wide.
Yeah.
And then we see, looking at this plan, that it's kind of a bit more complicated than that.
Yeah. It's got...
It's got a completely round interior, which has got 2 side chapels and a
end chapel.
end chapel,
Yeah.
which has got 2 side bits as well. But it's completely round on the interior. It's just that the circle on the interior is kind of not what you see on the outside.
No.
And he is kind of hidden in the fact that you're never like being able to see the inside and the outside at the same time. 4 huge, thick piers, which are on the sides of the side chapels and support the dome, and they kind of buttress everything and suppress all those like lateral forces.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that also gives him the ability to have this perfect circle with arches coming off it. It's quite clever.
It is, yeah. It's always fun when you have these, when you have in plan these walls which are actually very, very thin in certain places. But you would never know from looking from the inside. But there are these little moments where you would actually only be, about 6 inches away from the outside or something like that. But it's still,
Borromini goes to a real extreme in some cases.
Yeah. There's a famous Borromini church that does this as well. But yeah, it's one of those fun little revelations of the plan.
And I think that's a kind of pro architecture. Architects like that, right? Where you're just using, or it feels like a clever, fun thing to do, to use the fact that you kind of never experience the inside and the outside at the same time to allow you to kind of make the 2 different by having wildly varying thicknesses of wall.
Different, but nevertheless
But the wall is never useless.
Yeah. They're different, but they're both totally coherent. Is the kind of... Yeah, is the trick that you want to pull. And then the decoration is also pretty wacky. It's like very yellow stucco with white stucco decoration. And there's a lot of decoration, a lot of sculpture, a lot of figures lounging on various pediments. It all has a slightly louche feeling to me for a sacred building. It's got,
I feel that I'm not sure how much Palladio actually had to do with any of this.
yeah.
It was definitely all done after he died,
Yeah.
in terms of the interior.
I don't know. I mean, he does love sticking statues on everything, doesn't he? But
He does, and I'm sure they were trying. It was done by the Barbaro family, who were completely on side with the Palladio project.
yeah, but it does have a slight like bordello kind of quality,
Yeah.
doesn't it? The colour scheme and the
It reminds
richness.
this is more resolved than it, but it reminds me of some of the late style quality that we had in Michelangelo. You know, Sforza Chapel, where we've got great new ideas. It's bold. It's kind of making a bold synthesis, but it's not quite pulled together.
Yeah.
You know, the Church of the Redeemer is so resolved.
Oh yeah.
It's like completely nailed it. Like, that's a 5-star, as in it has nothing which detracts from it. There's nothing that's like glaringly wrong. Whereas this is very clever and somewhat unbalanced, which is not what you were. I think if he'd had more energy, life.
It's slightly like letting your hair down as well, isn't it? This is
Yeah.
like, you know, I'm an old guy who's like got into DJing or something. You know, like,
Well, I mean, he's an old guy. When he's starting this, he would have been very much confronting his mortality.
yeah,
He was, I think, in his 70s when he started the design for this,
yeah,
which is very old in the 16th century.
yes. Well, some people did live a long time.
They did. Michelangelo lived even longer.
Some people did live a long time. But
it's nevertheless.
yeah, I think generally being an architect seems to have been good for your health at that time. I think
Yeah.
as long as you didn't have too much in the way of lifestyle factors.
I guess
Like-
people got into it a bit late as well.
Yeah.
You know, I think we think of Raphael as more of an architect. I mean, I know we do think of him as an
Yeah,
architect,
yeah.
but we think of him as more of an architect if he didn't die,
Yes.
if he lived longer.
But that was lifestyle factors, wasn't it?
Um,
Or people tend to attribute it to.
yeah. But I mean, you could say lifestyle factors with Michelangelo. He certainly didn't look after himself. I suppose being extraordinarily Spartanic is probably a better view.
Lacedaemonian habits.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's a lovely
That
little,
drawing right.
it's a lovely little thing. This is so we're just looking at there's an elevation. I suspect it's correct, or more or less correct.
Yeah.
There's like a lot of the drawings which there's basically a whole set of drawings of his designs which is done by another guy called Scamozzi in the 18th century, different
Yeah.
from the other
Different
one.
from the other Scamozzi. Related, I think.
Yeah, I think so. This one guy's called like Octavius Scamozzi or something like that. Anyway, but yeah, I like the rendering of this in this. I like how kind of it accentuates its like stern windowlessness of it. It's very monumental. It really the Pantheon reading is extremely clear in this one because it's got that kind of like dark, rather brooding quality that the Pantheon has.
And I think this is a Palladian quality where Palladio is making his buildings appear like a singular thing rather than a repetitious grid. You know, on the scale from massive corporate skyscraper through the Renaissance block of like lots of windows. And churches can be like that too.
Yeah.
His churches will have this and the Church of the Redeemer have one opening in the front facade,
Yeah,
which is the door,
yeah,
and are very monolithic. And symmetry aside, there's one of everything.
yeah,
You know, that might be one pair of something on either side, but like each thing is different. Whereas
Yeah.
if you think of like the front of St. Peter's, there's a
Yeah.
lot of repetition.
yeah.
And it makes it much less exciting. And that is a quality that Palladio is generally bringing to his architecture, I think.
Well, should we try
And
and
then he died.
should we try and leave it there? I mean, yeah. So he died in what year did he die in?
Okay, so he died.
So he died.
Tell us about it.
He died in. So he died in 1580.
Yeah, 15.
August 1580, and he was predeceased. He was predeceased by basically all of his immediate family, including his children.
Which is the problem when you live to a great age in a time of low life expectancy.
Yeah,
I think it's one of the crowning achievements of modern civilization that people generally do not have their children predecease them.
no, yeah. So I don't know if he had any surviving children, but there is also
We don't know a huge amount about his biography compared
Yeah.
to other people because he wasn't especially famous in his time.
yeah,
Um,
and he
it certainly didn't. Architecture brought him neither great fame nor great fortune
yeah. Well, not straight away. Yeah,
in his lifetime.
he has some renown
Now, yes.
in the present day. Bit late, but there you go.
And immediately after his death, it took some time to get going, didn't it?
Yeah, the Palladio myth. the
It
kind of
didn't,
hymn.
This building, this last church, I would say, was lost almost to complete obscurity.
Yeah,
The churches in Venice were known because they were significant churches in Venice.
yes,
The villas, you really had to go to them. To an extent, he was rescued from obscurity by his book
yeah,
and by the interests of a few other travelling architects.
yeah.
He didn't have an immediate strong influence in Italy.
No, he, but he did become of interest to architects elsewhere in the century after.
So,
his
for
death.
example, Inigo Jones,
Yeah,
in the first decade of the 17th century, is trying to chase down,
yeah,
20 years after he's died.
yeah. And then, 100 years or so later, he's very much the cool thing. So,
So, for another, I guess that's a lesson. If you're feeling underappreciated now, you
Yeah.
may become famous 100 years after you die.
among a clique of foppish young aristos.
Yeah. His influence has gone off in a number of directions, but it
Yep.
didn't go off into the Baroque particularly.
No, definitely. The architecture of the 17th century in Italy doesn't really look a lot like this.
It's really informed by the tradition of Rome.
Yeah. Well,
And probably this is like the end of the heroic period of Venetian architecture.
true. Till Scarpa.
Until Scarpa, yeah.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of stuff going on in Venice in the century before this,
Yeah.
and there was not a huge amount of stuff going on in Venice, architecturally speaking, in the century after this.
A lot of having affairs and getting typhoid and that kind
Oh
of
yeah,
thing.
I mean, it was still it didn't completely
still a
cease to
lively
exist
place,
as a
yeah.
state as well, and
Yeah.
history was going on,
Yeah.
but the efflorescence of culture,
Yeah.
which was very much, you could think of there's significant works of the significant painters of this period.
Yeah.
There's some interesting music, although not really into the main sort of swing of things yet, going on in Venice, and other significant architects of this period as well in Venice, not so much later.
Yeah. Well, I think we should leave it there because otherwise it's going to get dark.
Cool. That'll do.
Yeah.
We're going to get in trouble. I mean, yes, there are I guess it's like Tiepolo.
I don't know.
And,
Well, just post a comment or
Yeah.
send us an email or something like that. It's all engagement. If you are watching this, that you've probably watched all the other Palladio ones. in
Yeah,
order
we're
to get
recording
here.
this one before some of the others due to
Yeah,
the vagaries
yeah.
of scheduling.
Yeah. If you stuck with us through all of the other Palladio episodes in order to get here,
Well done. I mean, the best thing would
Congratulations.
be
Yeah.
if you have if you've woken up and YouTube algorithm has chained you through from the beginning to the end
yeah.
in a state of unconsciousness.
It's like watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's that kind of effort. Congratulations. If you are listening and want to see images, there will be a whole stream of them, and also, Instagram stories and all kinds of other
Goodies.
forms of content on our social media, which Matt will put up. We are at about_buildings on the main platforms. And if you want to help fund the podcast and also get access to occasional bonus content, you can do that via our Patreon at patreon.com/about_buildings. All the links to everything are on our website, aboutbuildingsandcities.org. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for listening.
Yes.
It's very kind of you.
Yes.
You have remarkable patience.
Yeah. And now for something completely different.
Yeah, I haven't quite decided what yet,
Yes.
but we will have done by the time this has come out.
Yeah. All right.
Good night.
I'll catch you
Bye-bye.
on the next one.